Okay, just give me a second to make sure everything is doing what it's meant to be doing. Okay, I think we're good to get started. So welcome back to those who were with us last week, and a warm welcome to those of you tuning in for the first time. My name is Rasha Manna. I lead the United Nations Development Programme SDG Impact Initiative in Jordan. And just very briefly, this initiative, which focuses on the private sector, aims to mobilize capital towards inclusive and responsible businesses that are solving for some of the most pressing societal challenges, as outlined by the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the second session in our series, and it's happening every Wednesday at the same time. And what we're exploring is the notion of resilience. And when we talk about resilience, this really refers to beyond the ability to withstand a crisis. It also relates to the ability to recover from a crisis and the ability to adapt in ways so as to be better equipped to navigate future crises. And in each session, we're going to explore resilience at the different levels that are needed to be built up to allow for resilient economies. In the last session, we hosted Sal Gianbanco. And with Sal, we spoke about resilience at the level of teams. And Sal talked to us about how leaders can be navigating during times of great uncertainty. And I want to share three of the things Sal mentioned during his conversation. The first being, Sal spoke a lot about the importance of being proximate. And by that, he was referring to looking at the immediate relevant challenges and opportunities specific to your company, specific to your industry and to your country. And he also spoke about the importance of not leading from a place of fear, saying that fear-based decisions result in suboptimal outcomes. And rather, in the third point, he spoke about the importance of looking at data, analyzing the data, and making evidence-based decisions. But here Sal said that in times of great uncertainty, we should look at what the data is indicating for the near term so that that can guide decisions and actions we're taking today, as opposed to trying to extrapolate from that future scenarios. And maybe this is something our speaker today is going to touch upon, because today we're shifting the conversation to resilience at the level of companies, and specifically how companies can be leveraging big data and digitalization to become more resilient. Usama and Reem, if I can invite you to turn on your cameras. And as they do that, I'll also point out that we're going to be posting the videos on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page under SDG Impact Jordan. As I mentioned, we've got a different moderator every week, and there's no better moderator for this specific topic than my good friend Reem Khouri. Reem is the CEO and founder of Wise, which is an impact analytics software solution that helps companies aggregate their data in real time, analyze the data, align with international impact standards and benchmarks so as to allow for evidence-based decision making. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Reem so she can get started on today's topic. Reem, all yours. Reem, if I can just unmute you. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Rasha, and thank you to the UNDP and SDG Impact Jordan. It's very valuable to have a platform that allows us to learn and share insights in times like this. Usama, thank you so much for making the time, and it's so good to see you, even if it's on Zoom. I would like to first ask you to share with us your reflections from a data and technology point of view. What has happened to us as societies given the new reality that we're facing?
Yeah, and good evening, everyone, or good morning from San Francisco here. And great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Rasha, and thank you for doing this, Reem. Let me start by saying that the changes that have happened are very deep and very foundational. So, you know, we can set aside kind of the virus and the health concerns. A consequence of what has happened in terms of the world reacting mostly by going through lockdowns and stopping work and stopping a lot of activities is the acceleration of anything, right? So electronic commerce, electronic government, electronic delivery, all sorts of activities in life, including meeting people, including social interactions and so forth, have had to suddenly, by force, has had to move to the digital channel. So what has happened is suddenly digitization, which was happening anyway around the world, took a huge leap forward out of necessity. And everybody, whether they were a laggard or a doubter or a late adopter, suddenly had to adopt new technology, adopt digitization, accept this new reality of e-channels entering our lives in ways we never thought about before. Accept the fact that travel is going to get reduced physically. Meetings will all go online, just like we're doing here. That actually moved us into the digital world, with some parts of the world ready for it, some parts of the world not ready for it, and those who are not ready for it are getting a first-hand lesson in how critical and how important this is to our resilience, be it in banking, be it in telecommunications, be it in any field you like, news, communication, government, what have you. So the changes are here to stay. They are permanent, meaning even if the world were to open up tomorrow, it is very unfortunate that with shocks or with waves of change, some negative things come out of it. Of course, many opportunities come out of it, but that change being permanent essentially says that very likely, 20 to 30% of the jobs that existed before will exist no more. Now, the change was happening anyway, and it was gradual. What has happened now is we kind of dove off a cliff. And when organizations who typically will take on change, but will accept it slowly, and that will give us a buffer to kind of adjust as a society, when they are forced to adopt a new change and they see that it works, that risk aversion goes away, right? They realize now that, okay, well, I can make my business work with fewer people. I can make my business work online. Hey, actually, I don't need people to travel as much. I don't need my salespeople to go, to those places. They can do with 1/4 the number of meetings, what have you. We don't need physical goods as much as digital goods. We don't need to meet to sign contracts. We can do that electronically. All of that is going to have huge ramifications in terms of shifting the kinds of skills and the kinds of jobs that will essentially survive and prosper and grow post this transformation. But the transformation is here, and its impact is more permanent than many of us would like to think.
Yes. So we're gonna come back to several of the points you just made, but maybe the first point would be, how should organizations approach this digital transformation? Today, a lot of companies are thinking about risk management and risk mitigation, but digital transformation strategies cannot be short-term and need to take into account long-term growth. So how do these organizations need to think about investing in their digital infrastructure and put on a strategy for the long term, so that they can survive the wave of change?
I think, and that's a great relevant question. So two things here. Number one is, this is an opportunity to learn from the past, right? So digital transformation as an idea, started, well, you could argue 40, 50 years ago, but really accelerated in the last decade, where organizations suddenly realized that I could go to scale, I could go to efficiency, I could go to more customer satisfaction, I could go to a mode that gives users a sense of control. Like, all of us like to use our search engines and like to, in many cases, self-serve and get what we need on demand, etc. And I would say our first chance is to learn from the mistakes of the past. So these people who have been, or companies and organizations who have been going through this transformation, let's say the past 20 years, they made a lot of mistakes, right? And those mistakes are there for all of us to learn from. I will tell you from the perspective of data, and I'm supposed to represent it here, one of the big things that happen when you digitize is you lose that human-to-human interaction, you lose the ability of employees in the company, people who are concerned about satisfying the customer, making sure the customer is happy, etc. Most classical businesses rely on that intimate knowledge of the customer to know how to make their services relevant, to know how to service that customer. What happens when you go digital is, yes, you've now scaled the interaction, you're dealing with a lot more customers, but even worse, you no longer see what is happening to that customer. Are they happy? Are they unhappy? Are they receiving the service? Are they not? Are they planning to leave? Are they planning to stay? Are they planning to expand? Can they bring their friends? Can they bring their family, etc.? That goes away, right? So think a great example I've been personally involved with, especially when I left Jordan to go to Barclays in 2013 and be their global chief data officer, was primarily around that, which is banking historically had been very human oriented, very branch intensive. You know, you go visit the branch manager knows most of the customers and the staff. They know what's going on. They know when somebody is going through a good time or a bad time. They know whether the behavior is risky or not. Suddenly, banking went digital, right? You got mobile apps, you got the web apps, and you got ATMs. Great, so customers are getting great service, but the business no longer knows what's going on with that customer, right? So lesson number one is you need to figure out how to avoid being blind as you digitize, being blind to behaviors and customer interactions. And this is where data comes in a big way. This is why data has been gaining relevance over the past 40 years, but especially over the past 20 years, where almost everybody has demand for data scientists, for data engineers, for people who understand data. It's not because they love data. It's not because they want to build databases. It's because it's becoming the one and essential way to understand what are the various channels, because they all went digital, and how effective are they in communicating, in delivering services, in detecting problems, in addressing problems, in responding to customers. So most digital transformations, historically, I said we can learn a huge lesson. When they took place, when they happened, people got very obsessed with let's digitize, let's automate. And then they woke up after the automation saying, well, great, but now I don't understand what's going on with my customer. I don't know whether I'm effective or not. I don't understand why I'm losing business here. Why am I gaining it there? And that's when suddenly they woke up to data. So big lesson number one is plan for the data from the very beginning. Data is effectively a substitute for your eyes, ears, and often the communications. Learn new ways of listening, learn new ways of measurement, learn new ways of analyzing the data. So that's an example where data, which was probably more, very, very irrelevant to many, many businesses of the past, suddenly are extremely relevant and are needed by all these businesses in very foundational ways and in very strategic ways. So do not do a digital transformation without thinking through data. And the big lesson learned, and one of the reasons why I'm very busy these days also, or have been for the past decade, is that most of the companies who have done this transformation, I would make an exception of the companies that were born online, right? Companies like Google or like a Facebook, where they knew this from the very beginning, or Amazon, right? They knew it from the very beginning, that data is a huge entity that we need to worry about, and it's our key to success, our key to relevance. Most other companies took digitization as a way to automate, and most companies moved into it kind of blindly, and then woke up and said, we forgot about the data. We forgot to measure these things. We forgot to set up an analysis for this. We forgot to have staff who understand how to deal with data. So that's a big lesson that we should not do now in this wave that's being forced upon us with acceleration by the immediate crisis. But crisis or no crisis, we were heading in that direction anyway.
Thank you, Usama. Usama, can you touch a little bit? When we were preparing for this session, we also spoke about the agile technology, and it's not all digital infrastructures are the same. If you could touch a little bit on that.
Yeah, a lot of the, humanity in general, businesses, governments, what have you, organizations, as they move into this digital world, um, the problems are not well understood. Nobody really knows what is the perfect design. Nobody really knows what is the right thing to do. So the way to react to that, the way to be resilient against entering these dark areas that nobody understands, and you're exploring it, you're trying it for the first time, aha, so and so discovered a better way of doing this, etc., is you basically give up on the notion that you know what you have to do, right? You basically, one of the big humbling lessons of going digital and kind of relying on these new senses that come from data is that a lot of our intuitions, a lot of our expectations are not right, and the data proves it to be wrong many times. So what that means is the approach of saying let's make a big plan and let's execute the plan over a long term becomes a bad approach. That's known as the waterfall, right? I design it, I plan it, I start executing it, I test it, then I launch it. That waterfall approach is too slow. By the time you're done, the world has changed because the evolution is so fast. And in most cases, I will tell you, almost 100% of the cases, the program managers, the company managers, etc., will admit, actually, no, we had it wrong. We actually thought people would do this, but they really want to do that. We really thought this would work, but it didn't work. Something else worked. A way to react to that is to go to Agile. Agile is a simple approach that says, look, I give up on knowing long-term what the project is going to look like. I will do it in steps. And I will do it in steps where with each step, each iteration, I kind of achieve one thing that touches, that closes the whole cycle of interacting with a customer or of delivering a service. And I'll see how that happens. And then I will choose the next cycle based on my experience from the previous short cycle. By doing it in short cycles, you approximate the right curve much, much better than trying to predict the right curve and go on a long journey and then find out that you're off of what's really happening out there. So that's where Agile comes in a big way. And luckily, technology, especially in the computer programming area, in software, etc., and in cloud, allows us to do a lot of this much faster and much more rapidly. So our sprints are usually 1 or 2 weeks. We look at the end of it, see what we achieved, get some feedback, and change the next sprint or the sprints after it. Instead of doing it on a 12-month project, we now do it every 1 to 2 weeks, in fact.
So that brings me very much to our next question. When you're talking about this transformation and what it requires, what skills or reskilling or trainings do we need to invest in as organizations to make sure that we have the right, not just the right skills, but the right mindset in doing this?
Yeah, this is a very important and fundamental area that's very important, especially for our society in smaller countries like Jordan. Is how do we react to all of this, right? And in my opinion, always, these challenges, these sudden changes come with a lot of built-in opportunities, and it's really up to us to figure out how to react so that the opportunity turns into a benefit to society and to the way we do things. So for example, here, we need to acknowledge very early on that a new set of skills will be needed. As a lot of these jobs will get replaced, and unfortunately, some of these replacements will be accelerated because of this whole accelerated digitization. What happens in terms of closing that gap and making up for these inevitable losses that will happen, right? Just because there'll be a lot less travel, a lot less physical business, a lot more electronic transactions. Well, we need to have a new generation of workers who not only are comfortable with the digital channel, but are actually potentially contributors and or builders in that channel. And that's a whole part of society which requires quick change. It requires a lot of collaboration between academia, the government, the private sectors, to kind of embrace and jump on it while the opportunity is hot. And I'll tell you, the opportunity is hot. You take areas that are extremely valuable. Let me focus on data, for example. In data and in cybersecurity, the shortages of talent in the world, right? And you take the greatest powers and you take the richest countries. I'll use the United States as an example, right? This is all pre this, coronavirus disaster that's hitting the whole world. And it continues after, by the way, little affected by it, is the following. Data scientists, right? You talk to somebody on the street and you talk about data scientists, right? These are people who know how to manipulate data and use it to create predictions from the data, to understand it, to get insights out of it. And you ask, what is the demand for data scientists in the US, for example, alone, right? And I've been involved in an industry initiative that's doing this at scale across the US and across the world. The numbers are incredible, right? If you look at the number of job postings, the number of openings for people who have qualifications for data science versus the number of new data scientists being produced, right? Every year, that gap is 170,000 positions, right? So the demand outweighs the supply by 170,000, right? And that's an example of a huge opportunity. By the way, we have similar kind of patterns in cybersecurity and in a few other areas that are like this, where the good news is it takes a little bit of training and a little bit of experience to become very proficient and competent here, right? But you have to have a technical background. So for example, a lot of the jobs that don't have technical backgrounds become less relevant. A lot of the jobs that have engineering, sciences, and technical background, mathematical training, become much more relevant. But imagine now we can tap into this amazing demand. And these jobs are very high paying, by the way. They typically pay 2 to 3 times the average kind of job in technology. And the demand is phenomenal. The ability to deliver remotely is huge. So what more do you want, right? That's an amazing opportunity to sort of say, great, if there's that kind of demand and we're a small country here that can actually produce a lot of people and we can reskill ourselves and we're great at learning and teaching, take advantage of it and become one of the big suppliers of any of these areas. Does not have to be data science. This applies, by the way, to digitization in general. Engineers who know what they're doing, who know the latest and greatest in technology, in open source, in leveraging a lot of these cheaper ways of building things fast, in doing it the agile way, are in huge demand by all sorts of companies all around the world, not just in the Middle East and not just in Jordan. So that's an example of another area where we can take advantage. However, like I said, change is difficult. As a society, we need to kind of look at it, accept it, embrace it, and say, this is where we need to focus, right? Jordan has done an amazing job as an example in the area of medicine and medical training and so forth. It has done a great job in kind of basic IT. We have not done such a great job in kind of more advanced areas of IT. And we can get there. And by doing that, we can become extremely relevant to the rest of the world.
Yes, I mean, we definitely had a hard time finding data scientists and product managers. I know a lot of startups that are in our network that actually have that problem. And so this is a fantastic opportunity, definitely for us in Jordan. I wanted to ask you, a lot has been said about how this pandemic will probably have consequences on data privacy and civil rights. And in your very first remarks, you were also talking about, it almost feels like we're going to be talking about humans as data points. How should we address this as organizations? How should we think about how we structure our data and the privacy of the data that we have?
Yeah, this is an area where unfortunately all the news is very bad. So with the emergency responses, right, and for all the right reasons, I don't question the reasons behind them. It's, health comes first, and it's important to preserve life, and it's important to protect us against, enemies unseen, etc. These states of emergency, always the first victim in them, whether it's a state of war or a state of emergency, is kind of the whole notion of privacy. So what is happening now with the acceleration of digitization, with the acceleration of the use of digital channels for communication, with our reliance on them for social and business interactions, comes a huge loss of privacy and the whole notion of kind of protecting rights and protecting data and all of that. I have been a participant in many efforts all the way back from when I first was acquired by Yahoo back in 2004, throughout experiences in banking, in telco, with governments, etc. I have observed kind of for a while kind of a healthy direction where people started worrying about privacy, worrying about things like in Europe we have GDPR, which basically says you can't retain data for reasons unless you have direct reasons to retain them. You need to get the permission of the data owner, which is the consumer. The consumer has the right to be forgotten. They can delete data you have about them, all of that stuff. Unfortunately, when you enter an emergency case, all of that gets thrown out the window because I want to do contact tracing. I want to do, I want to be able to detect threats very quickly, etc. And that part of the future is, unfortunately for all of us, is very dark. Now, the best way to do it is to kind of understand it, understand that it's there, understand that it's a reality, that almost everything you can do will be monitored and will be recorded somewhere and can be retrieved later, and change your behaviors to kind of compensate for that and or comply with it. It is not something I like personally. In fact, I highly dislike it, as much as I'm optimistic and bullish about opportunities and challenges, opportunities coming out of challenges. This is one area where, let's say, the tendency to go in the dark side, in the dark direction, is much stronger and much higher and much more difficult to resist in times of emergency. We've seen this happen, by the way, before, like in the US, which for the longest time bragged to the rest of the world, we are the land of freedom, we are the land of rights, we are, after what happened in September 11 of 2001, was an almost immediate and continuous and unstoppable erosion of civil rights, of notions of privacy, of the ability of the government to tap into any communication, of the ability to, there were institutions who by law are not allowed to spy on US citizens, for example, by law, right? They are designed to kind of protect the US against external threats. They gave up all that and they started effectively spying on their own population. And this is the country that basically is typically used as an example to the rest of the world of, like, where we value freedom highly. So be very careful. We need to just approach it with moderation, but also realize that it's not stoppable. And what's happening in China and other places will only help accelerate the kind of move to the dark side, because in China they were able to show that, hey, I can track more. I have no regard for the privacy. There is no such thing as privacy. In fact, I will monitor every move you make in society. And they went as far as creating social citizenship scores, right? Where if you make a mistake, it gets tracked against you. And if you do a good thing, it gets tracked for you. And then if you don't have enough points, you don't have access to certain public services and all of that, you get punished. That's a very bad extreme. But the rest of the world watches it and they say, oh, well, we can do that too. And that's very scary.
That it is very scary indeed. Usama, I'm all about impact. Sorry about the siren noise. One of the biggest fears we have is that always when there's accelerated transformation, we always see inequalities. And so my question is, how can we be inclusive and ethical in the way we adapt and thrive during these times? Truly, my question, and we're also, the question is truly about how can we have, or can we have, a sustainable tech-enabled economy after this?
Yeah, so two parts to your question, two parts to the answer to your question, and I'll keep it very brief because I know we're running out of time, and hopefully the sirens will quiet down. Number one, these changes, unfortunately, are going to bring greater, not less, inequality in the short term, right? The difference, the gap between the haves and the have-nots will grow bigger, faster, unfortunately, right? Now, the real question is what can we do to mitigate against that? And this is an area where, like we referred to before, training the new generation, adopting and embracing the new digitization of society and social interactions and business interactions, and becoming a contributor to them is a way forward, especially for countries like Jordan, where there is a huge demand to the rest of the world. It will take them longer to respond. We are smaller, we can respond faster, and we can take advantage of the situation and create these new skills. However, that actually requires, anytime you go into education, education is expensive, education takes time. That requires a huge a push by the government to kind of collaborate with the academic sector to enable the population to kind of go into learning mode, and to help the private sector in help reskilling their workers, right? That private sector is going to go through the changes, is probably going to lay off a lot of people, and it's very sad. A lot of people, as companies discover they can do without their help or without their services, are not going to be coming back to a job. Many of the companies want to do the right thing. They just have a responsibility to their business as well. So help them do the right thing. Help them, help the government, and help academia in the reskilling, the retraining, the embracing of the new technology, and having the population kind of reskilled to address it. We cannot ignore it. One of the things that scares me most, especially about Jordan, is if we try to pretend that this is, you know, things will go back to normal, it's only a few months, everything will be fine. I think the changes are much more fundamental, and economic changes and economic forces are going to basically have been forcing a new reality on us. I think that that forcing function comes with great opportunities. If we are to adapt, if we are to embrace it, if we are to realize what are the new areas of demand and how do we answer them and how do we shape ourselves to answer them, it's a huge opportunity, and it's a unique opportunity, and it's a great opportunity for small countries like Jordan that have a high level of education and a hunger for job and work.
Thank you, Usama. Usama, I'm going to start taking questions from the participants who have been extremely patient with us. I am going to start with the question that got the most votes, which is, data is super important. Who should own the data?
That's a very tough question. The ultimate answer to it, in most situations, if we were in normal circumstances, everybody is converging on the idea that it's okay for companies to record behaviors. It's okay for governments to record behaviors, but the ownership and the ability to utilize those behaviors falls in the hands of the users, of the consumers, basically, the people who actually generate these. And I think we will see new generations of companies that will evolve to help capture and protect that data and allow the consumer to benefit from it whenever it is used. So we will get, just like we have banking in money, we will have banking in information. This will definitely happen, right? However, like I said, unfortunately for all of us, in these times of emergency, and I actually fully agree that the emergency will go away. Like this, the emergency will not last long. The changes are going to be what lasts very long. We need to think very hard about these ownership issues, and we need to think very hard about how to take away a lot of the temporary emergency measures that are used as an excuse to kind of take over a lot of this data, take over a lot of this information that should be private, that should be owned by other parties, and answer them. The question of who owns it ultimately? I mean, it's a tough question. What I'm finding, even though the answer is tricky, is after a lot of iterations, a lot of trial and error, you always wind up going back to saying, well, the people who generate those behaviors are the ones who own them. Now, the question, of course, data is data, right? Sometimes the data is about machines. Sometimes the data is about a factory. Sometimes the data is about a country. And there, the answers are different. But I think the question was primarily around kind of issues of privacy and who owns social behavior and individual behavior data. And in my opinion, or at least in my experience, it has always fallen down to the person who generated them as kind of the stable solution we know about. And I think if you take that economic principle and build on it, you'll probably end up coming up with new structures like information banking.
Thank you, Usama. Another question, and it's a question after my own heart. How could we involve humanity, in your opinion, in the digital world?
Great question. And we can by basically, I mean, this requires training and knowledge, right? Just like, you know, you look at the evolution of civilization, right? There was a time when the most important skills to teach the next generation were hunting and, you know, fishing and how to go after prey, right? Then there was a time when the best skills to teach were how to practice agriculture and how to do farming right and all of that. And that then evolved into how to build, and that evolved into how to manufacture. And unfortunately for kind of the MENA region, you know, the whole industrial revolution went by with hardly any participation out of the MENA region in general, which is very, very, very sad, and has contributed to the growing gap between East and West, or North and South, however you want to divide it. I think the new digital era, it requires basically education, and education around understanding kind of the technology behind it, understanding how to think strategically about change and about the creation of these new channels of communications and interaction. We talk a lot, say at Open Insights with our customers, we talk about the economy of interactions, right? And how the world has evolved from an economy of transactions to an economy of interactions. And the economy of interactions is about people interacting with each other, with a lot more data measured around those interactions, which help a business understand what's going on better. It helps explain the context. It helps create the content that's relevant, and it helps kind of predict what is needed. Those kinds of skills are trainable, teachable. We just need to embrace them, and we need to recognize strategically from the public sector to the private sector to the academia and educational sector that this change is happening, and therefore training and equipping the population so that being comfortable with technology, understanding digitization, understanding data are critical for the future. And those are the skills that are important, just like medicine is important, and just like engineering is very important for many other fields.
Thank you, Usama. I have a number of questions related to from startups or related to startups. And some of them are saying hi to you, by the way. We're currently facing a catch-22 situation where as startups, we are advised to invest in digitization at a faster pace, but we're worried about investing and not generating any revenue. And of course, not knowing for how long this would last. Please share your reflections on priority areas of investment for non-tech companies. I'll read another two that I think could be part of the same group of questions. So Dr. Usama, in summary, you think it will be digitize or perish. Isn't this great news for tech startups? And another one is how to sell big data solutions in a startup market that is not necessarily yet aware of the value proposition for that.
So first of all, I really miss all my friends at the startups and all the partners I've had and all the companies I worked with across the Middle East and in Jordan, and you know, all the early stage acceleration we did. And I miss you guys. So number two, this is good news and bad news, right? So the bad news is times of trouble like these, times of economic hardship, and by the way, there is no question about it, the United States will absolutely go through a deep recession, if not a depression, right? And what happens in the US will get emphasized in the rest of the world in many ways. In areas where kind of economies start shrinking or we go through a recession, the money available, the ability of customers to buy from startups, all of that will actually begin to dry up. So that will become a very difficult time for startups, right? And now the good news for startups is, and this goes to the second question, is if you think hard about relevance, then the opportunity also multiplies, right? Because these very companies, the big companies, the governments, the private and public sectors, they need to adapt. And who better help them adapt than these startups if they are working on relevant things? And by the way, just to also address one of the questions you brought up, relevance does not mean you have to be a technology company. I said the skills, you have to have the technology skills, but relevance can be at the level of, how do I make a social network work for say the Middle East? How do I make it work in a society where you don't have enough digital penetration yet? How do I navigate those transitions? How do I educate the next generation? So that the fields can be in any other areas of business, and many areas for startups to work in do not have to be technology directly, right? But the important part is they need that underlying technology skills base to be able to establish their relevance. Just like, when you open a shop, you need to have somebody who can design it for you, make it attractive, make the environment friendly. You need that similar kind of set of skills for making your digital business relevant. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think startups need to think very, very hard about, we have a favorite word out here in Silicon Valley, we call it pivoting. Pivoting just means sensing what's changing in the market, realizing the new demand is somewhere else, and being able to shift very quickly towards that new demand, right? That is very hard to do if you're small or if you're big, but it's a lot easier to do if you're small than it is to do if you're a big organization, because in a big organization, you have to deal with all the internal politics and issues and disbeliefs and all of that. In the meantime, startups can quickly shift. But what I would advise everybody, all my friends who are working on startups, this is the time to look very hard, detach any emotional attachments you have about the old kind of ideas you had, and look as to where the new demand, because reality has changed. Reality has changed. For many companies, this will be very relevant because they're already working on digital. For other companies, they need to change to go in that direction.
Thank you, Usama. So the area of priority is to rethink their services and products.
First thing to do is to rethink. This is the time, by the way, when everybody's down, you need to sit down and think as an entrepreneur, as a head of your own small business or even medium business. What has changed? Accept the fact that things have changed. And when the world reopens, it's going to be a different place. How am I relevant to that new different place? It's very, very important to do that. It's much easier for a startup to do that than a big company. And that is your chance.
Thank you, Usama. I have another question that says, as a small business, my clients love and appreciate the personal connection and relationship I have developed with them. I'm at a stage where I need to scale my business, but I worry about losing that personal touch connection with my clients. How can we maintain some semblance of human connection while scaling and digitizing?
Yeah, very interesting question, very important challenge. And by the way, that's a good challenge to have. And that's a challenge that, in fact, that all companies have been dealing with as they've been going to digitization, right? Even the largest companies in the world have been dealing with this challenge. And I say the biggest learning lessons here is to basically look at the born digital companies like the Facebooks, like the Amazon, like the Googles, etc. And there's many of them in fintech, in many areas, and sort of see that how much they rely on data, how comfortable they are with data as the new way to kind of sense. And then the other side of it is embrace the electronic medium for communication, right? So, one of the things we do with Open Insights, we have teams all around the world and many of them working from home now, of course. And I insist that the managers of those teams and that we do kind of multiple daily interactions that are forced, where we actually turn on the video, we can look at each other, we talk, we don't just rely on Slack or messaging or WhatsApp or what have you. Talking is very important because email messages can be misinterpreted 100 different ways. Communication is hard to begin with. One of my favorite quotes that's kind of making fun of this area is one of the most difficult things about communication is the illusion that it has taken place, right? You could actually be talking to somebody and each of you is hearing something different, let alone if you're trying to do it on a channel which is a lot less rich. So that is a very important area, and I do personally invest in it a lot. I'm spending a lot more time with teams, with customers, and I try to do it with video, with an ability to kind of do it more frequently and stay relevant and stay in touch.
Thank you, Usama. We have a question on, it says, regional governments have always been on the side of traditional industries that employ large numbers, and they have always protected them to avoid a mass uproar. Now with these changes and the fact that e-services typically don't allow for equal opportunity for small retailers compared to large companies that are more aggressive, do you think the government will cause us to miss this revolution again?
Yeah, so I don't know if I necessarily blame the governments, right? Governments by their nature are always going to be reactive, and it's not their job, but part of their function is to be proactive and to think about where the future is heading and to try to head in that direction. But usually governments reflect kind of what society is doing, and things get bad when you accept the status quo, kind of live in denial of a change that is happening around you. And as a society, as a whole, as a government, as a country, you could lose your relevance to the rest of the world if you don't. And we have plenty of examples in history of that happening to nations that kind of go in that denial for a while. It actually happened to China when they built their walls and said, we're close to the rest of the world, until they became basically one of the most backward nations around. And then they did their own revolution and recovered from it. That change was violent. It wasn't easy. It was tough on a lot of people, but it was important for them to kind of go through that awakening and retool themselves to the future. It happened to Korea. It happened to Vietnam. It happened to many countries. So the main thing here is to basically realize that government is reactive, and to basically realize that you just need to show government and show organization and show society the relevance of the new areas and have them react. I would not wait and rely on them to help us move to the new directions. I would actually take on the role of saying, I need to show you the new direction, and then they will follow. Unfortunately, in the interim, that stuff will happen. By the way, during the 2008 financial crisis, right? A lot of big banks got bailed out. A lot of automobile companies got bailed out. It was a reaction to kind of keep things as they are, and the impact wasn't necessarily that positive. It didn't, some of it was done correctly, and in many cases, the taxpayers ended up benefiting from that because the way these things were structured, they allowed the government essentially to make money off of the recovery of those sectors. And thankfully at the time, the US averted what potentially could have turned into a very deep depression and benefited from it. So there is wisdom in kind of protecting what's going on, but you need to be very careful as a government to sort of figure out what is it that you're protecting, right? And we see examples of this. The first tendency of a government is let's help everyone. And let's, of course, they will help those who make the highest noises and those who have the most power. And by definition, those who have the most power are the most traditional businesses right now. And unfortunately, those would be the guys who would least recognize the fact that the world is changing from under them, because they're going on the assumption that, everything is going to come back to normal, right? You can try to bail out airlines, but what if travel never comes back and is unlikely to come back to the levels it used to be at, even after this whole pandemic is gone? That means that has deeper implications, and nobody's, for example, thinking those through. And where should the investments really go? It's a very tricky question. Public policy is very tough. You need a government that can balance kind of the established businesses against kind of where we know the future is heading. So one thing I would say is a no regrets move for the Jordanian government, for example, to think about is, what are we doing about digitization? What are we doing about reskilling people? What are we doing about addressing the new areas of demand in the world, and how do we make ourselves relevant to those?
Thank you, Usama. Which brings me to the next question. So it says the International Monetary Fund released a report last week titled "The Great Lockdown," stating that as a result of the pandemic, the global economy is projected to contract sharply by -3% in 2020, much worse than during the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. For countries such as Jordan, how do you think data science will play a role in tackling this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's the fact that there will be deep economic ramifications, and I actually think it will be much worse than those numbers personally. This is unprecedented, right? That we haven't gone through a time when society kind of hit the brakes suddenly on all fronts, all at once, without even knowing what does it take to restart the engine, right? And this is a problem, right? When an economy, it's very hard to have a self-starting economy, right? So you need to figure out what is it that you need to restart it, and nobody has figured that out, right? We don't even know. For example, in the US, if they lifted all restrictions tomorrow, how do things get kick-started again? It's not obvious, right? So that's number one. Number two, how do we make ourselves relevant? Well, we know, for example, we know for sure that there was a shortage, and there's an increasing shortage in skills in data science, in cybersecurity, in digitization in general, right? In user experience online, in, what have you. Pick any area you like in this new frontier, and there is demand, and it's huge demand. So the first question I would ask myself sitting there is, how do I make myself more relevant here? And how do I actually figure out how to direct myself towards that demand and start addressing it? And the good news is, as a small country, it doesn't take much for us to make a huge difference for us, right? So if we, imagine what happens if we created a $1 or $2 billion a year industry, right, in addressing some of these needs to the rest of the world. And by the way, I guarantee you the rest of the world will come shopping if you have those skills, because they cannot find them anywhere else. And they will go shopping to whoever provides them, right? And so there's competitors out there. That's why we need to move quickly. But 1 or 2 billion for an economy like Jordan is huge, right? It will make zero difference in the US. It will make very little difference to many European countries. It will make a huge difference for us. And in fact, what's more important, it actually defines the path to the future and puts us on the right direction of being relevant and being there to address real needs in the world, enabled by the fact that most of these needs can be answered remotely over networks, from the home office, all that good stuff. You are muted, Dream.
Yes, sorry, I keep forgetting that I'm muting. There's a very interesting question about, how do you assess the cultural challenge? Isn't it critical to build a data-driven culture for driving database decision-making, innovation, and ultimately company success? Yeah. In Jordan and MENA, this has been holding us back. In Europe, regulation has increased risk avertness. How can we change culture?
Yeah. And that's a very important question, and I don't claim to have an answer to it. One of the things we say to a lot of our customers and to our team is that culture will eat strategy for breakfast anytime. You can have the best strategies, you can have the best technology plan, and if you don't have the cultural change and the readiness to accept it, the culture will actually completely destroy it, right? And will completely kill it. Now, I don't have a formula other than two things working for you. Number one is, the way we address it typically is we end up running what we call data academies. And we've done that in many organizations, some of the big ones in Jordan as well, where it is about data literacy and data education to open up the eyes of managers, middle managers, executives, frontline workers, that, hey, this data is valuable, it can make a huge difference, and here's why it's very, very relevant to what you do, right? When you open people's eyes up, they start using it, and that's how cultural change happens. Now, the other advantage, if you like, in this situation, that looks very bleak, is that the shock to the system is typically enough to shake up, cultures and have people question whether the way they do things needs change. And that's the first step towards change, right? And that, I think, is happening. I think many, many more businesses are now more receptive and more understanding for digital transformation, more receptive to understand, okay, how do I deal with it? What do I need to know? And we need to take advantage of that shock to actually put us on the right direction versus the wrong direction. The wrong direction is to think that things will go back to normal and all we have to do is just wait it out. That is, I guarantee you, I will say this with high confidence, I guarantee you that is absolutely the wrong thing. Some profound changes are taking place and they are being accelerated by this pandemic and by this emergency. Accelerated. They were happening before, they're being accelerated. So we need to figure out how to react to that.
Yes, I agree. I mean, change is here to stay. It's not transient. Yeah. There are a group of questions regarding jobs. So the fear of when we're talking about a cut of 20 to 30% of jobs lost, how would that affect diplomacy, international affairs, international cooperation? What can nations do to mitigate this relatively high risk? There's a question similar or close to it. How do we balance the healthy, rapid change with the quick, distractive change? So I'm bundling a few questions together in this.
Yeah. I mean, here, like I said, it's bad news, good news, right? The bad news is many jobs will never come back, right? We talked about startups before. It is unfortunate. Many startups will not survive. The survivors will be the ones who can kind of pivot in time. Sometimes you can even do the best pivot in the world, the best change of direction. But if you don't have the cash flow and the money, it's unfortunate, and that business will not survive. And startups are not, one of the weakest areas for startups, as an example, is kind of where the cash flow and an ability to kind of buffer these big changes and have the time to recover. Now, back to the jobs question. So if you believe what I said, which is that 20 to 30% of jobs will disappear forever, that is a shock to society. And the right answer is to kind of quickly figure out, what do I do in that case, right? If you had a job where it's easy for the company to realize that, hey, I can actually get by without you doing your job, right? And we are all impacted, by the way, and this is impacting, my friends, my family, all of that. You need to immediately kind of take a look and say, well, is this the right time for me to reskill, like go to school again? Is this the right time for me to change proactively and not wait for it, because it's going to come, right? And how do I now strive to make myself more relevant, right? There's a lot of jobs in the economy, globally speaking, not just Jordan, where people have jobs that are I don't want to say easy, but are easily replaceable by technology, by automation, by digitization, and they managed to kind of maintain those jobs and got used to that lifestyle because the government, for example, was too slow on picking up digitization or picking up these new, or their company or what have you. Now that everybody's being shocked into digital transformation faster, these changes will happen faster, and therefore, it's really going to be up to the individual first, and then the government and the companies second. But it's the individual that needs to kind of face reality and say, look, I know this is tough, so what am I good at doing? What else could I be doing, right? And I know we face this question all the time, and I know this is not easy to do, and I know the transition will be very, very, very difficult. And I wish we didn't have to go through this kind of tough transition, I wish we had the luxury of kind of smoothly going through that change slowly as we were before, but I think that option is off the table. So now we're going to have to deal with that tough time. I don't have good news there, and I don't really have an answer.
To ask the question a little bit differently, if we would say, what would the opportunities be, instead of looking at the negative side, what would the opportunities be for societies, for governments, for organizations, startups, but also larger organizations at this point?
Yeah, it's basically what we said before, which is the realization that as everybody accelerates into digital, their dependence on things like data, their dependence on things like an ability to build relevant digital products, relevant digital channels, relevant ways of delivering their services and goods, right, under the new regime of digitization. Those are the skills that will be needed. And the skills, I mean, a lot of it is technical, but a lot of it is also kind of, business oriented, strategic thinking, management thinking. If you're used to kind of managing in an old style way, managing projects in a, old style waterfall, using classical, very expensive tools, and you're ignoring what's happening in the world of open source, in the world of leveraging what others are doing, in the world of APIs, which is, interfaces between systems and putting things together, what we call mashups, etc. That is the world that will become relevant, right? And a lot of this is about familiarity. A lot of this is about learning. Well, what does this new landscape look like? And how do I navigate it better than others and faster than others? And the good news here, to end on a good news note, is the demand is there, the opportunity is there, and the opportunity will be local and will be global, and both of them will be addressable. So we just have to have the right skills. And I can't say this enough. If we actually prepare ourselves and have those skills and have something to offer that is relevant, the demand will just simply drive value back to us. And that is the way to address it, is, think about relevance and use this opportunity to kind of use up the good side of it, which is it will generate a whole class of new jobs, a whole class of new skills, and a whole way of new way of doing things. And we can be at the forefront of doing that through education and through learning and through general knowledge.
That's a little bit more hopeful. I think we have time for one more question, if I'm not mistaken. And the question is, to pivot in these tough times, how do you evaluate the level of ease in terms of legislation and digitization and digitizing the offerings of SMEs and acquiring needed compliance measures, including website integration and going live with a payment gateway? So probably mostly questions about the need for agility and fast response, and not necessarily having the equal agile legislation to work with us.
Yeah. This is definitely an area that where the government also needs to change in how it's doing things and how it thinks about regulation and legislation, and how it thinks about how fast they can do stuff. You see, by the way, it's challenging. I'm not saying this is easy. You see in the US, they tried to launch the CARES Act, where they, for example, would extend the payroll protection program to all small businesses. The program was kind of well designed, but it was very, very, very poorly executed. So the money, got stuck in banks, didn't make it in time. By the time, only the bigger companies benefited from it, not the smaller ones. So these challenges happen everywhere to a lot of governments. But my advice here is we need to think in a much more agile way, right? One of the great reactions of the US government, for example, when it came to the Food and Drug Administration and the approval of, new drugs, the approval of new trials, they basically said, look, this is an emergency. We're going to accelerate a lot of this, and we're going to prioritize. That is something that we need to think very hard about, which is in that journey to become more relevant to the future, what should the government be doing? What should the regulators be thinking about? How should they be relaxing and not tightening and allowing kind of these new directions to take place? Because usually governance and legislation is a follower. It's not usually a leader. Therefore, governments need to realize that in times of change, they need to kind of relax certain rules and allow more freedoms, and then go back and legislate and clean up and figure out how to regulate once things take off. But you cannot live in a world where you pretend not much has changed and prevent the new change from happening. And that's a formula for disaster.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of change that needs to happen on multiple sector, and we're just hopeful that we will all adopt this concept of agile working, whether it's in the private sector, but also in the public sector and the not-for-profit sector as well. We have another 5 minutes, and if I'm gonna ask you to, I'm very partial to startups, right? But I'm also very partial to the impact world and the not-for-profit world and to social enterprises. And I think that there's a lot more today pressure on social enterprises and foundations and not-for-profit organizations in terms of their work is very much needed. But what advice would you give them? They probably did not have, a lot of them did not have the means or the funds to focus on digitization. How can they continue to do their work? What's a word of advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, the advice is to, realize the reality that things are going to change, that change is always uncomfortable and tough. But also realize that as smaller organizations, you have two advantages. One is change is much easier for you than it is for the larger organizations. And two is that the ability to innovate is one of the things that startups will excel at, because they are created to think outside the box, to try new approaches, to kind of break the norms, right? And we have great examples of this. I mean, including in our own history of Arab civilization and so forth. A lot of people don't think about it, but one of the great advantage that the less trained, less organized armies of, say, early Islam, as they spread, they were fighting against two very large established empires, right? The Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And one of the biggest advantages they had, believe it or not, was the Arabian horse, which is smaller, lighter. A lot of people would make fun of it, but it's a very fast device compared to other. Think of it as a military tool here. And the other part was the lack of armor, right? The Romans would have to carry all this heavy stuff, heavy swords, and the fact that the Arabs were running around with much lighter swords and the ability to run circles around elephants and around big organized phalanges actually allowed them to have an advantage. And it was a huge advantage, and it was an amazing advantage, and it created a very rapid transformation. So I think startups need to think about this. We have agility, speed, innovation. How do we use it? Whether I'm doing it for social good, or whether I'm doing it for social profit, or whether I'm doing it for actual monetary profit. How do I use that agility as an advantage? And how do I go where the demand is and kind of try to address it very quickly in innovative ways? I know this is too abstract and it's not a formula for how to do things. The hardest part about all this, by the way, is to accept the fact that things are changing, and to realize that one of the tasks you have as working with or for or running a startup is to actually think about, where is the new direction? What is an innovative approach I have to address that new, or to take me in that new direction, and how do I execute on that fast? And execution, of course, in the end is the most important part, but this is the time to think about the change of direction before you start executing. And by the way, I am very hopeful. I do think that this brings a whole new set of opportunities for our region, and I hope Jordan kind of reacts correctly and takes advantage of it.
There are a couple of questions that came to us, and I think we still have a few minutes. There's a question on if there's anything we can do to minimize the effect of the expected zero privacy and totalitarianism societies, or we should accept it and be happy that Big Brother is watching us.
I would never say be happy that you are being watched, but I would say if you're aware of it, you can actually navigate it. And if you're aware of it, you can be careful what you do, right? A lot of the problems come from the fact that people ignore it or forget about it or etc. If you're aware of it, you can adjust to it, and you can figure out better ways to cope with it correctly, so that at least what is being recorded, what is being captured, doesn't come back to kind of hurt you. So you can minimize damage in that sense. The other hope I have is that these times come only in times of emergency, so that what I know for sure, well, I said that the changes will be lasting. The pandemic and the emergency will go away, and we will be back to kind of a more normal way of at least living, in which case, these things will get addressed over time correctly. So that part of it, while the bad stuff will get accelerated, it's also being accelerated right now for the public good in a way. And hopefully we will all wake up and say, okay, now it's time to rethink things as we normalize and we no longer have an emergency on our hands. And it's almost guaranteed that we will emerge out of this, and there will be no emergency on our hands. We just have to learn a new way of living and a new way of reacting to the environment.
Thank you very much, Usama. Thank you so much for the participants and for everyone that's been with us. I think we just ran out of time. Thank you so much for your time. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. And again, thank you to SDG Impact Jordan and the UNDP for this amazing platform.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.